Hello and welcome to the video. Today I'm going to show you how I built this small dovetail box with a sliding lid. Come and check it out. Now the reason I have a stack of birch firewood in the background of this shot is because I made this box out of a piece of firewood just like these ones. Here it is. This entire box is from this one piece of wood that I have in the vise. To turn this piece of wood into material I could work with, I started by sawing it into slices of wood about 5/8 of an inch thick, or somewhere around there, I didn't measure. I wanted to get 3 usable slices of wood out of this piece. It took a lot of effort sawing, but eventually I made it all the way through. And when I looked at the wood inside the cut, I knew that this idea could work and turn out okay. I sawed the other slice of wood and ended up with these 3 long pieces. I grabbed a straight edge and marked 2 perpendicular lines onto 2 pieces I was going to use for the carcass of the box. I removed the material on the outsides of these lines, starting with my hand saw, removing the bulk of the material, and then with a hand plane working down to the line. Now for the second side, rather than using my original line on the other side, I got out my marking gauge and chose a width that would work well for both pieces. But it was the same idea. I used that same method of cutting with a saw and then coming with a hand plane to get the pieces to final width. Once this was done, both pieces had the same width, but they didn't have the same thickness. One piece was much thicker and had a very uneven and rough surface. So I used my marking gauge again, referencing off the clean face of the wood, and I marked a line at the thickness I wanted. I got the piece in the vise, and then got to work planing the face down to its proper thickness. Both of these pieces tapered off in thickness toward the end, but I was still able to make use of most of the wood. I put some pencil lines on the pieces, marking the middle section that was usable. I figured I would use the longer piece for the 2 sides and the shorter piece for the 2 ends. I set up some stop blocks on my miter saw and quickly cut 2 side pieces that were about 5 inches each and 2 end pieces that are about 3 inches each. And now with my pieces roughly milled, I was ready to start cutting my dovetails. I measured the thickness of the pin boards and marked them as a depth line on the tail boards. Then I measured the thickness of the tail boards and marked that as a depth line on the pin boards. I marked out the dovetails the way I normally do when I want 2 tails. I mark a 1/4 inch on each side and then a 1/4 inch in the middle. I square those lines across the top, and the 2 big spaces that remain in the middle will be the tops of the tails. I start my saw straight along those lines, and then I use my dovetail jig to guide my saw at the correct angle for the cut. I remove the jig at the very end of the cut and saw slowly as close to my depth line as possible. Once I have made all 4 cuts on each piece, I get ready to remove the wood on the outsides and between the tails. The way I remove the wood between the tails is different than many people. It's a method I picked up from a woodworker named Paul Sellers, who's really great, and even though it might not be the quickest method, I think it's the most enjoyable way to remove the material. I mark that depth line with a knife or chisel and then pare the wood toward that line. Once I've removed the material, I chisel to deepen the knife wall, and then I pare away more material, alternating between those 2 actions. I work from both sides until eventually I make it all the way through and the middle piece comes free. Once it's out, I put the piece in the vise to remove any bits that were left behind. Next, I remove the pieces of wood from the sides by sawing straight down my depth line until that piece just falls off. I repeat the same process for all of the tail boards. Once they're all done, it's time to mark the tails onto the pin boards. To do this, I actually clamp the box together as it will be when fully assembled. This ensures that everything will fit together nicely when I go to put the box all together, and it also ensures that it don't end up with a zigzag shape instead of a box. I take time to line everything up and then mark all the tails onto the pin boards with a sharp pencil. To cut the pins, once again, I start my line across the top of the piece and then use my jig to help me saw as straight up and down as possible. When I saw, I place my saw blade just inside the lines I've made. If I saw on the line, the joint will be loose. If I saw outside the line, the joint will be really loose. Sawing just inside the line should get you right where you need to be. Again, once you finish making your saw cuts, you can remove the material in between the pins. Again, I use that same method of paring away the material and chopping straight down at the depth line. The only difference here is that there are 2 larger sections of waste that you need to get rid of. And as you chop, you need to be aware of the angle of the tails, but you should get the hang of it fairly quickly. Once all the material is removed and you've cleaned out the spaces, it's time to put the box together for a test fit. At this point, you might need to remove some more material, but I was able to get this together without too much trouble, and it fit rather nicely. There were some places where either the tails or the pins protruded a bit, and a place where there's a bit of a gap, but those would be easy enough to deal with after it was all glued together. But before I glued this together, I had some more things to do. I needed to make a groove for the bottom of the box, as well as a groove for the lid. I started with the groove for the bottom. Before I made any marks, I used a plane to make sure that all of the bottom pieces were flush to each other. Then I got out my marking gauge, and while the box was still assembled, I marked a line 1/4 of an inch or so from the bottom of the box. I did this while the box was assembled to ensure that the grooves would line up properly. Once I had my lines marked, I took the box apart and used a marking knife to make those lines deeper. Then I measured just over 1/4 of an inch from that line to make the second line for my groove. I chose just over 1/4 of an inch because that is the width of my smallest chisel and my small router plane, and this will make it much easier when it comes time to remove the material in the groove. Once I had both lines marked out on each piece and had used my knife to really make those marks deep, I began to remove the material. But one quick note before I do this, for the tail pieces, I don't carry my groove the entire way through the tails. If I did, there would be a hole in my joint. I stop the groove 1/4 of an inch into the tail, and you'll see this as I go. I've seen many people use a chisel to chop grooves like this, but I prefer a different method. I use a wide chisel to pare down to where my knife line and remove a long slice of material from either side, leaving a bit of a peak in the middle. At this point, what I'll do is come in with my 1/4 inch chisel and just plow out that material. Basically, I'll keep removing material in this fashion until I come close to my desired depth. In this case, I'm working to a depth of 1/4 of an inch, so I set that as my depth on my router plane, and once I've come close enough with my chisel, I get my final depth with the router plane. Again, I'm very careful at the ends to make sure I don't destroy the joint I've worked hard to make. The tail pieces take quite a while to finish the groove, and I'm just kind of showing you some of the highlights here, but this did take quite a bit of time to just get all the material removed the way that I wanted to. The pin pieces are much easier because I can make a groove across the entire piece. This makes it much easier to remove material quickly, especially using my router plane, working from the one end and slowly working backwards towards the other end. Once I've got all my grooves cut, I'm ready to make the bottom of the box. To do this, I'll use this piece of wood. I cut it to rough length, and then I use my marking gauge to mark 1/4 inch thickness that it will need to fit the groove. I saw away most of the waste and then set it actually on top of the vise in this configuration to plane down the rest. I remove material until the entire bottom is just about the right thickness. At this point, it's a matter of doing a bunch of small test fits and making small adjustments to get a nice fit. I measure the length and make that cut, and then I use a hand plane on one of the edges to adjust the final width for the piece. After a lot of small adjustments, the bottom of the box fits nicely into the groove while the joint is assembled. But it's still not time to glue everything together. I still need to make a groove for the lid. I mark at the top of my groove the same way as before. I make my first line where I feel like it needs to be, and then measure another 1/4 inch to the other side of the groove. And then I go about removing material. Once again, paring down, then it's just plowing through the waste with a chisel and coming down to the final depth with my small router plane. The reason I don't need to put any grooves into the end pieces is because the lid will butt up against the one end, and at the other end, it will just sit on top. So I don't have to do anything to the one end piece, but I'll need to cut the other end piece basically in half. I put a mark on that end piece where the top groove meets it. I connect those lines together and then cut the piece almost in two. I also at this time had to cut away part of my dovetails where they met the top groove. I cut straight down to the bottom of the groove and then turn the piece vertical and saw it down from the top. I'm doing this so that the lid is able to slide into the groove without being blocked by the tails, and you'll see how this works in just a second when everything's assembled. Once I had made those cuts and cleaned them up, I was almost ready to glue the box together, but first I sanded all the faces of the wood that would be difficult to sand once the box was assembled. Once I did that, I glued it all together. I spread glue into the joints, I put together 3 sides, I slid the bottom piece into the groove for the bottom and tried not to get any glue on the bottom, as it's nice if it can move a little bit freely. I didn't put any glue in the groove, and then I put the final side on, trapping the bottom piece in the groove. It was somewhat of a challenge getting all the joints to seat properly, but using some clamps, helping with this, you can hear the joint fully seat right here. I wiped away the excess glue and set the box aside to dry in the clamps. While the box was drying, I got to work on the lid. I contemplated keeping some of the natural birch bark in the final product of the lid, but decided against it. Instead, I would make the lid 1/4 inch thick so it would nicely slide in the grooves. I marked 1/4 inch on all sides of the piece I would use, I sawed away the bulk of the material, and then I planed the rest of the wood down to the line. As I did this, I made sure to go slow and sneak up on my mark, testing often to ensure I didn't remove too much material. I got close to the right thickness, and then I measured again for the width. I used a hand plane to get close to the correct dimensions. Then I got out the sandpaper and used that to get the final fit for the lid. This way I could get a nice finish on the lid while ensuring a proper fit. If I sanded after fitting, it would make the lid too loose. I slowly but surely got the lid all the way into the groove, and once I had the box closed, I marked a line where the lid butted up against the box and cut the lid so that there wouldn't be any gaps there. I then closed the box again all the way and marked another line where the lid met the end of the box so there wouldn't be any overhang, and I cut on that line as well. I carved out a finger grip for opening and closing the box with my gouge, and after some more finessing, the lid was finally finished. At this point, the box was also dry, and I was able to get to work preparing for a final finish. I started by sawing off some of the pins that were really protruding. This shows that I could have taken some more time to dimension the lumber, but it wasn't the end of the world. I got out a palm sander and used that on all the main faces. This box is probably really too small to be using a palm sander, but I tried to be as careful as I could to not mess up the shape too much. I used a palm sander for a coarser grit of sandpaper and then switched to sanding by hand for the final touches. But before the final sanding, I mixed together some wood glue and some fine sawdust to fill any small gaps in the joints. I used a small slice of wood to push that mixture into the cracks and wipe away the excess. Now I was ready for final sanding. To do this, I placed a sheet of sandpaper flat on my bench and sanded all the faces of the box. I went over everything multiple times, going with the grain. I had my shop vac ready to clean the paper quite regularly during this process, and I sanded all the sides until I was happy with how it all looked. I finished the box with several coats of homemade white bond polyurethane, and this finish really made the birch wood in this box look amazing. It's really cool to think that this box came from one regular old piece of firewood. I'm really happy with how this turned out. I hope you enjoyed watching me make it. Until next time, take care.